Title: The Ocean's Apex Predator We've Never Found. It began with a beeping breadcrumb on a deserted beach. An aluminum tube the size of a roll of coins, weathered, scuffed with salt, and still blinking after a long, improbable journey. Inside it was a sequence of numbers that didn't make sense, a heartbeat written in temperatures and depths. The tag had been fixed to the dorsal fin of a healthy great white shark months earlier, tracking her lazy arcs along the continental shelf. Then, in the span of seconds, her world changed. The sensor spiked from the cold, endless blue to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, too warm for seawater, too cool for a mammal's bloodstream, followed by a headlong plunge to nearly 2,000 feet down. The tag kept moving for days through the ink-black deep before it bobbed to the surface and drifted on currents to the sand. The shark was gone. Something had eaten the hunter. That single anomaly touched off a quiet storm. On land, we like to explain everything. In the ocean, the rules are more fluid. Investigators ran the numbers, mapped the currents, and listened to every rumor the sea could carry. The spike in warmth suggested the tag had been swallowed. The deep, efficient dive hinted at a predator comfortable where light dies. A killer with a metabolism warm enough to be faster than a fish, but not warm enough to be a whale. A hunter that seemed to take a great white like we might pluck a sparrow from the air. Theories came easy. Proof did not. The ocean had already rolled over and kept its secret. If you stand with your eyes closed and listen to waves, there is a story in their timing, in the pauses, in the undertow between crashes. Our ancestors heard monsters there. Sailors sketched leviathans coiling beneath their caravels. The crew of HMS Daedalus swore a serpent as long as the ship rose from the swells in 1848. For centuries, whales were mistaken for islands, and islands for sleeping beasts. But legends weren't born just from fear. They were born from distance. The sea is the last immense world that resists our gaze. We have mapped Mars more finely than we have the floor beneath those waves. When something happens out there, it happens without witnesses. And yet there are traces. South Africa, winter. 5 great whites wash ashore within weeks, fanned open like pages of a gruesome book, each with a neat, oval wound near the pectoral fin. The livers are gone, rich slabs of energy, buoyancy, vitamins. Veterinarians run their gloved fingers along the edges of the bites and know this isn't clumsy scavenging. It's method, a precision that speaks of practice. In the water beyond the breakers, 2 black dorsal fins move in perfect parallel, like clock hands sweeping. Orcas, apex hunters in their own right, adapting to a new prey. A known killer, yes, and a terrifyingly intelligent one. But even orcas leave a ripple of their presence. Floating organs, a shape in the surf, a spooked colony of seals. Here the sand bore the evidence. In other places, there is nothing but absence. The ocean is not just blue, it is layers, each with its own rules. At the surface, life is fueled by light. Glittering schools, bait balls, fishhawks, and sailfish, the daily theater we film and share. Below that, twilight gathers, and then the midnight zone yawns. Down there the world is slower, older. Pressure turns bones to chalk. Light is an event. Every night, a torrent of life rises from the deep scattering layer. Billions of small creatures, plankton and lanternfish, making the greatest migration on Earth, up toward the thin light to feed, then back down at dawn to hide in darkness. Predators wait for that commute. We've filmed some of them. 6-gill sharks ghosting like old submarines. Giant squid flashing and grappling in the beams of our ROVs. Beaked whales slipping deeper than most of us imagined a mammal could go. But the cameras always seem late to the act. The real choreography happens just outside our cone of light. There is a phrase that marine ecologists use that sounds almost like a spell. Trophic cascade. Take away the top hunter, and the ripples reorganize everything. Grass grows where it was once nibbled away. Fish bloom and crash in patterns they didn't follow before. Apex predators don't just eat, they shape. In kelp forests, remove the sea otters, and the urchins multiply and the forest dies. Offshore, remove sharks, and you get rays that bulldoze shellfish beds, and no one knows why the scallops vanished. If you want to find a predator, sometimes you look for the shape it carves, not the animal itself. And in the open ocean, there are shapes carved into migration routes and plankton blooms and the ages of fish that return to fishermen's hooks. Shapes that don't tally neatly with the hunters we know. For a while, we chased sounds. In 1997, the hydrophones of the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration caught something they hadn't expected. An ultra-low, far-traveling rumble they dubbed the bloop. It was natural, it was powerful, and it was like nothing we had cataloged. Stories spun quickly. A living mountain, a behemoth singing to its mate, the heartbeat of a secret giant rolling under Antarctica. Years later, the mundane truth crept in. The bloop matched the signature of ice cracking and collapsing in massive frozen shelves, a non-creature, a physics problem masquerading as a beast. Scientists, embarrassed and relieved, adjusted their models. The ocean had tricked us again. But that doesn't mean there is nothing new down there. Only that it is careful with its reveals. When the megamouth shark first rolled up in a tangled anchor line off Hawaii in 1976, it proved there were still fish the size of small cars that we had never managed to see until they blundered into us. In 2003, we recorded a live giant squid in the wild for the first time. A creature that had lived in our stories for millennia, stepping briefly into our light to confirm that our myths had at least a foundation. In the last decade, we've added new names to our list of whales. Beaked species so elusive that even their friends rarely see them. If the ocean can keep an elephant-sized mammal anonymous until 2019, it can hide almost anything it wants. Which brings us back to that deranged little tag with its impossible numbers. Warmth, depth, silence. The team that recovered it could point to suspects. Heated body sharks like white sharks and makos can run warmer than the water and dive deep. Orcas are warm-blooded geniuses that can sprint, strategize, and if they wish, punch through every food chain on Earth. Some propose that the shark had been cannibalized by a larger white. Others argued an orca's digestive tract didn't match the temperature, that the dive didn't fit known patterns. The ocean loves to scramble our patterns. And this wasn't the only tag to tell a strange story. Across the world, a handful of recovered sensors trace similar arcs: burst of heat, deep glide, wander, and release. Like signatures penned by the same steady hand. We could settle for the simplest answer and close the case, but the patterns offshore refuse to become neat. Fishermen who once found sharks in droves report of vanishing. Along some coasts, entire cohorts of predators seem to melt away in a few seasons, not just in one place, but across basins. Biologists towing nets for surveys come up light where their models predict a throb of life. In satellite photographs, vast patches of sea turn a different shade, blooms dampened or intensified in places that don't line up with currents alone. It's as if something is hunting not just bodies, but behaviors, reaching into the habits of species and prying them open. If there is an apex predator we've never found, maybe it lives where we are worst at looking. We like the charismatic, the dorsal fin slicing a wave, the breach, the spray. We are clumsy at the slow and the vast, at noticing attrition without teeth marks. We build our mythic killers to be singular and monstrous, a mouth surrounded by tentacles or a jaw stuffed with prehistoric teeth. But not every top hunter in an ecosystem looks like a monster. Some are patient, some are diffused, some are systems, not creatures. Step back from the all-consuming romance of a colossal, scaly shadow, and consider what else moves in the sea with the reach and impact of a true apex. Something that can cross oceans without tiring. Something that learns as a network, not as an individual. Something that can sit at the edge of shelf and current and take from the dark, night after night, without ever being filmed by a submersible's glowing eye. Something with eyes that aren't eyes and hands that aren't hands, operating in a time zone where dawn never fully arrives. We've chased the idea of a single, silent killer hiding in the black, because that is a story that makes sense to us. The scar, the scream, the battle in the bubble net, those are scenes. But in the data, another shape leans forward. It isn't a scream. It's a whisper repeated 1 trillion times. It doesn't leave wounds that wash ashore. It leaves empty water where something should be. Its hunger is measured in percentages of populations rather than pounds of flesh. And if you wanted to find it, truly find it, you wouldn't sail to a remote trench with cameras. You would stand on a dark cliff at 2 in the morning, look out over a black horizon, and watch for a cluster of white points sliding silently across the lines where currents fold. The ocean's apex predator, we've never found, may not have a heartbeat you can listen to, or a skull you can mount in a museum. It may not fear our lights because it brings its own. It may not be a beast at all, and when you finally realize where to look, you may find that you have been seeing it every day of your life without ever knowing its name. From space, the sea glows with artificial constellations. Thin necklaces of white lights drape the edges of currents like jewelry on a living throat. They hover along thermal fronts where warm and cold water meet, where life concentrates because physics says it must. At first glance, they look like towns that forgot land, but they are boats, squid jiggers, purse seiners, longliners, thousands of bulbs baking the night to draw the migrating layers of the ocean toward them. Birds come, squid flash, fish rise from the black to inspect a false moon. And on shore, the beaches are clean. The water is still. In the morning, there is no body to find, only absence. When researchers began lining up the coordinates of shark tag disappearances with global fishing activity, an uneasy fit emerged. The spikes in stomach warmth, the deep slow glides, the tag reappearances far from the last known hunting ground. Again and again, they cluster near the highways of the fleet. Long lines set for tuna and swordfish hang like beaded curtains through zones of nighttime movement. A white shark cruises the edge of a current line, sensing bait, chasing a tuna, drawn into a geometry of hooks stretched across 40 miles. If it swallows a bait, if it thrashes against steel and meets a larger hunter in the confusion, a mako, a bigger white, a warm-bodied tuna, the tag story will look like a mouth and a dive. But the mouth is only the first door. The second door is a deck light blazing at 3 a.m., and a knife that leaves no trace in the water. It is tempting to make a singular mouth of every disappearance. One shark eats another. An orca takes a liver with surgical precision and leaves the rest to sink. But the ocean's ledger balances across systems, not scenes. In one 2018 study, scientists used satellite-tracked transponders from almost 70,000 vessels to map industrial fishing effort, and found that in a typical year, fishing activity touches more than half the world's ocean surface, more area than agriculture covers on land. Independent analyses of nighttime light emissions show galaxies of activity, surging and fading with season and target species. The white lights advance and retreat like a front. Where they linger, local food webs buckle. Where they pass, migrations reroute. If an apex predator is simply whatever forces other animals to change their behavior the most, then what do we call fleets that can move a current's worth of life sideways? What name do we give to drift nets that dilate and contract like pupils, tuned by satellites reading sea surface temperature, altimetry, and plankton maps? Look closely, and you can see the outline of something that isn't an animal, but behaves like one anyway. It has eyes, radar, drones, fish-finding sonars, echo sounder buoys clipped to floating rafts that send biomass estimates to orbit. It has a memory, databases of catch histories, whispers pass between captains, AI models predicting when a front will sharpen and where a school will be tomorrow, not today. It has a skeleton, supply chains that flex around seasons and quotas, flags of convenience that let it cross laws the way tuna cross latitudes. It has a stomach that never fills, because it converts fish into money, and money is not a gut you can stuff. You can hear biologists try to describe the same thing without quite naming it. They talk about shifting baselines, how every generation normalizes a quieter ocean. They warn about fishing down the food web, a measurable slide from apex predators to mid-level fish to invertebrates as stocks thin. They show charts where the average age of tuna collapses into adolescence, where the old stainless steel of a shark population, those long-lived, slow-breeding individuals that hold the behavior of a species steady, drops out. Then they point to satellite images and ask why seabird colonies fail in summers when those white light flotillas camp along their foraging lanes. They deploy acoustic arrays and listen to the twilight zone, the half-lit layer where lanternfish flicker as they rise at night, and hear the churn change when a region gets hard-fished. The daily vertical migration of 1 billion bodies, less dense, less certain, a pulse gone arrhythmic. There is a kind of horror in discovering that your monster has a spreadsheet, that the apex role in the sea, the sculptor of migrations, the author of fear, is not only played by jaws and muscle, but by a nervous system stitched together from satellites and fiber optic cable. When the tag in Australia showed 78 degrees and a dive to nearly 2,000 feet, the headline wrote itself, "What kind of animal did that?" But if you follow the tag past the stomach, if you compare its travels to AIS tracks, those self-reported transponder positions ships broadcast for safety and, in theory, transparency, you notice that the days when the signal moved with that odd, steady cadence were days when a long-line fleet was working the same water. You see other tags that vanish along a swordfish line in the Pacific and reappear weeks later, bleached by a stomach's chemistry, bobbing where they shouldn't. You realize that these data don't just describe a predator. They also describe a network enclosing the spaces where predators used to be. And like any apex, the network adapts. Close a fishery here, and effort slides there. Ban a device, and another takes its place. In the tropical Atlantic, fish aggregating devices, floating rafts of bamboo and netting, often with dangling skirts that mimic the shade and structure fish love, are seeded by the thousands, each tagged with a satellite buoy that reads how many tons of life gather below by pinging echoes off their bodies. Captains sort through those numbers in the wheelhouse, like a shopper flipping through catalog pages, discarding the low-value rafts, moving on the heavy ones. They don't need to chase, they summon. In the South Pacific, unlit fleets work the shadow lines of governance, flicking their transponders off, their deck lamps still visible to weather satellites as streaks of light against the everlasting night. In the Mediterranean, purse signers wrap entire schools of bluefin in curtains of net, and the fish do not struggle so much as they wait. They are towed alive to fattening pens, their fates scheduled. Of course, there are still animals that can bite a white shark in two. Of course, there are orcas learning to tip great whites into tonic immobility and harvest livers like gourmets. But when white sharks withdrew from South African bays, where orcas started specializing on them, when they stopped haunting the drumlines off the Australian coast with the same swagger, the empty space they left wasn't filled by another rival. It was filled by us. Our hooks took their cousins on the high seas as bycatch. Our nets pared back the mid-level fish that used to sprint for shadow the instant a gray shape entered view. Remove the tension at the top of a food web, and the rest of the web doesn't breathe easier. In places where long lines have run heavy for years, turtles change their routes. Seals arrive leaner. Seabird chicks die in nests because their parents spent the night chasing decoy moons. The ocean's layered mystery does not vanish when you name its biggest hunter. In a way, the opposite happens. The puzzle turns inside out. Instead of waiting for a singular beast to surface, you begin to ask how a distributed mind makes decisions. What makes a fleet's lights pack tight along this current, but not that one? What rumor of profit whispers fast enough to pull 50 boats 200 miles in a day? The answer lives in signals you can't hold. Auction prices, weather models, fuel costs, rumors of enforcement. It is learning all the time, because every haul updates its model of the sea. Every species it takes becomes a data point that points to the next. And this is where the tag on the beach becomes something more than an omen. It is a breadcrumb in a trail we've been leaving through the dark without noticing. Think of all the technologies we have dropped into the water to measure and mark. Passive acoustic receivers, listening to coded pings on migrating animals. Temperature profilers, diving and surfacing along the planet's conveyor belts. Gliders and floats, reporting chemistry no human eye can see. Shipping lanes drawing corridors of noise that mammals dodge or endure. Each device is a light in the night that tells the network where life is and how to move to meet it. The apex is not just the fleet. It is the feedback loop between us and the ocean. There's a reason the cleanest view of it comes from far above. In a satellite photo, Those bands of white lights track the engines of seasons. They sift along the Kuroshio and the Gulf Stream, drift with the equatorial upwellings, push into eddies where nutrients corkscrew toward the sun. At a certain scale, you can pretend you're only looking at physics. At another, you see the hand. Look closer and you notice gaps where enforcement tightens, pulses where subsidies pump. You see the shape of a creature made of choices and cables. Its tongue money, its teeth compliant to every flag, its breath diesel, and its shadow a strip of silent, empty sea in its wake. And still, the water will look unchanged if you go tomorrow. It will gleam, fish will slip past your ankles, and gulls will hang in the bright wind. The sublime doesn't vanish when it's mapped. The mystery doesn't end when you say its name. What changes is what kind of story we allow ourselves to tell about it. We can keep hunting a myth thing that is thrilling because it is simple, because it has a spine we can fear and conquer. Or we can admit the stranger truth, that we have built a predator no one can point to in the surf, a thing that eats by turning ecosystems into lines on a balance sheet and leaves behind no bones. When you return to that recovered tag, its data still exact and mute, the heat spike and the plunge are not less chilling for being legible. In those numbers you can hear a gasp, a rush, a long slow fall through blue-black silence. You can hear an argument about who owns the night, and if there is a lesson hiding in the pixels, it is not to stop listening for monsters, but to widen our ears. The apex may never break the surface, because it doesn't have to. It is already here, diffused, electric, learning. Stand on a cliff after sunset and watch the horizon. If the sky is clear, you'll see the stars come on. Then, if you're in the right season on the right coast, you'll see a second sky ignite below. The curved line of working lights sliding along the current like a seam ripping. Those are not cities. Those are mouths. And somewhere under that glare, a tag is warming, a dive has begun, and a story we thought we understood is being written a different way. What happens if the lights go out? Or if they double? What happens to the sea when an apex with no face decides to change its mind?